The moment Minnie Redmond stepped off the stagecoach in Dust Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1878, she made herself a solemn promise. She would build her life from nothing, alone, and she would never, not for a single breath, allow a man to complicate it. The town of Dust Creek was exactly what its name suggested. A main street of sun-bleached timber storefronts, a church steeple that leaned slightly eastward as though tired of standing straight, a general store with a cracked window, a saloon that seemed louder than the whole rest of the town combined, and a livery stable that smelled of hay and horse and the particular musk of hard-working animals. The land beyond the town limits stretched in every direction like a sea of amber grass, interrupted by distant red mesas that burned copper in the afternoon light. It was beautiful in the way that wild, indifferent things are beautiful, not for your comfort, but entirely for their own. Minnie was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned severely at the nape of her neck, green eyes that assessed everything with the quick, deliberate intelligence of a woman who had learned early that no one would look out for her if she didn't look out for herself, and hands already calloused from years of work. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the last 4 years nursing her ailing mother and managing the small hat shop her mother had owned. When her mother passed in the spring, the shop had gone to cover the debts, and Minnie had found herself with a satchel, a small trunk, $40, and the deed to a piece of land outside Dust Creek that her late father had purchased years ago and never done anything with. She had no sentimental attachment to the idea of love. She had watched her mother love her father with a ferocity that nearly destroyed her when he died. She had watched her neighbor, a kind woman named Ruth, fall so deeply in love with a traveling man that she had uprooted her entire life to follow him, only to be left in a town 200 miles away with nothing. Minnie had studied these women and made her conclusions. Love was a beautiful word for a dangerous trap, and she had no intention of stepping into it. She intended to farm the land. She had read every pamphlet she could find about homesteading, had written away for information about soil conditions in that part of Texas, had packed seeds and tools alongside her dresses and books. She was going to build something real, something that could not be taken from her or walked away from, something that answered to no one but her own 2 hands. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Curtis who had barely spoken 2 words during the entire journey from San Antonio, helped her trunks down with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. "You sure this is your stop, miss?" he asked, squinting at her against the afternoon sun. "Certain," Minnie said, handing him a coin. He looked at her the way men often looked at women who were clearly not where society expected them to be, with a mixture of pity and mild curiosity, and then he climbed back up and drove the coach on, leaving her standing in the golden dust of Dust Creek's main street with everything she owned piled around her feet. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the general store. The man behind the counter was stout and pleasant-looking, with a thick mustache and spectacles perched at the end of his nose. A hand-lettered sign above the counter read "Hadley Weiss General Goods." "Afternoon," he said, looking up. "You just come in on the stage." "I did," Minnie said. "I'm Minnie Redmond. I believe I have some land a few miles south of town. I need to know who I speak to about water rights, and I need to purchase supplies." Mr. Hadley's eyebrows rose slightly. "Land south of town, that's the old Parsons Quarter section. Been sitting empty for years. You buying it up?" "It's already mine," Minnie said evenly. "I inherited it." He nodded slowly, studying her the way people in small towns study newcomers, trying to determine who she was, what she wanted, and whether she would cause trouble. "Well, water rights you'll want to talk to Judge Aldrich about. He keeps the county records. As for supplies, you've come to the right place." He paused. "You're planning to work that land yourself?" "Yes." He said nothing more about it, which she appreciated. He simply began taking her list. She arranged for her trunks to be stored at the boarding house run by a stout woman named Mrs. Clara Fitch, who was warm and practical, and seemed to regard Minnie's situation with the pragmatic respect of a woman who had also built her own life with her own hands. The boarding house had 3 rooms upstairs, a good kitchen, and a parlor with lace curtains that seemed slightly at odds with everything else about Dust Creek. "I'll only be needing a room for a few weeks," Minnie told Mrs. Fitch, "until I can get the homestead livable." "Of course," Mrs. Fitch said, and that was that. It was on the 3rd morning in Dust Creek that Minnie first encountered Milton Brenner. She was at the water pump behind the general store, filling 2 large pails, when she heard the commotion near the livery stable, not violent exactly, but insistent. A man's voice, low and controlled, and another man's voice rising to an indignant pitch. She looked over in spite of herself. The man doing the talking quietly was tall and lean, in the particular way of men who have spent years doing hard physical work outdoors. He wore a dust-colored hat pushed back on his head, a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and worn denim trousers tucked into boots that had seen serious use. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples from the heat, and a jaw that looked like it had been set with some determination at birth and had never softened since. His eyes, she would notice later, were a warm brown, though at this distance she could not yet make that out. The man he was speaking to was red in the face, gesturing wildly about something to do with a horse. The tall man listened with the patience of someone who had decided a long time ago that raising his voice accomplished nothing. He said something quiet, and the red-faced man sputtered, and then the tall man simply turned and led a dappled gray horse away with calm authority, and the red-faced man, apparently with nothing left to say, walked off in the opposite direction, still muttering. Minnie turned back to her water pails. She did not think much about him. Or rather, she thought about him for exactly the 30 seconds it took to carry the pails back inside, and then she moved on to thinking about soil preparation and fence posts. She spent the next several days making trips out to the land. She walked the quarter section herself, studying the grass, the slope, the rocky outcroppings along the south edge. There was an old stone structure on the property, not quite a house, more of a roofless foundation with 2 standing walls, and a well that she had someone check for her, and that turned out to be functional. The land was good, harder than she had imagined, but good. She could see what it could be. On the 4th visit to the property, she arrived to find a man on her land. He was crouched near the old stone foundation, examining the remaining walls with the focused attention of someone assessing structural integrity. He had a rope coiled over one shoulder and a hammer tucked into his belt. It was the same tall man from the livery stable. Minnie set down the tools she was carrying with a deliberate clank. "This is private property," she said. He looked up without any particular alarm, which she found either rude or very calm, and she hadn't yet decided which. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It's Miss Redmond's land. I am Miss Redmond." He stood up then, unhurrying himself, and tilted his head in a brief, natural courtesy that was not quite a bow. "Milton Brenner," he said. "I have the spread about a mile east. I heard someone had finally taken up this quarter section. Came over to see if you'd had a look at these walls yet." "I was just about to. I figured. The east wall's solid," he said, as though the conversation had been going on longer than it had. "The north one's got some settling you'll want to address before you build on it. The mortar's let go in about 4 places. Can be fixed, but if you build on it before you fix it, you'll have trouble." Minnie looked at the wall. She had not yet gotten close enough to examine the mortar. "I can see to it myself," she said. "I'm sure you can," he said, without a trace of doubt in his voice, which surprised her. "I'm just telling you what I saw, no charge for looking." He gathered his rope from the ground where it had fallen. "Good luck with the place, it's good land. Good water table out here." And then he simply walked back toward the east, toward his own property, whistling something low and tuneless under his breath. Minnie stood there for a moment and then went to examine the north wall. The mortar had indeed let go in 4 places. She made a note to purchase lime and sand from Hadley's. She told herself she was not thinking about Milton Brenner as she worked that afternoon. She was thinking about lime and sand. The following week brought the first real difficulty. Minnie had managed to secure a load of lumber from a mill 30 miles north, transported by a freight wagon driven by two brothers named Cutter. But when the wagon arrived, it was 3 planks short of what she'd ordered, and one of the Cutter brothers, the younger one, who seemed to operate on a different moral code than his sibling, informed her that the missing planks had been sold to someone else along the route, and that she could either accept the partial load or wait 3 weeks for the next delivery. She stood in the bright morning sun and calculated. 3 weeks was too long. The rainy season could begin, and she needed the roof frame up before any sustained rain hit. She needed 3 planks, 14-foot planks, 1 inch by 8. "I'll take what you have," she said, because losing what she had over what she didn't was foolish. She paid the man and watched the wagon roll away with a frustration she kept behind her eyes and out of her face. She was stacking the delivered lumber and calculating how to stretch it further when she heard hoofbeats. She did not look up immediately, because she had learned that looking up at every approaching rider was a form of anxious anticipation she didn't want to cultivate. "Afternoon, Miss Redmond." She looked up. Milton Brenner sat on the dappled gray horse she had seen him lead away from the livery. He had 2 horses with him, the gray and a bay pack horse that was carrying, strapped along its side, several long planks of lumber. She straightened. "Mr. Brenner, heard you had a delivery come up short," he said. "I had some planks left from when I redid my barn roof last fall. They're the right dimensions. You can have them." She felt the familiar pull of resistance. Taking things from people created obligations, and obligations to men had a way of shaping themselves into expectations she had no desire to meet. "What would you want for them?" she asked. He appeared to think about this seriously, as though it were a reasonable business question, which she supposed it was. "Nothing," he said. "They're sitting in my barn doing nothing. It would please me more to see them used than to see them rot. I'll pay you for them. They're not worth any money, Miss Redmond. They're leftover planks. I'll pay you a fair price for your time in bringing them over, then." He studied her for a moment with those brown eyes. She was close enough now to confirm they were a warm, steady brown, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was seeing her more clearly than she intended. "All right," he said. $1 for my trouble." It was less than his trouble was worth, and they both knew it, but she recognized that he was meeting her in a middle ground, and she respected that. She paid him $1 from the coin purse in her apron pocket. He unloaded the planks with easy efficiency, stacking them next to hers, and then he stood back and looked at the layout of the foundation and the stone walls and the lumber supply with an appraising eye. "You've got a good plan here," he said. "Where are you putting the main room?" "South-facing," she said. "Good light in the morning, and it'll catch the breeze off the mesa in the afternoons." He nodded slowly, and she could see that he had not expected this and that he was genuinely impressed, and she felt a small, involuntary warmth at that before she shut it down firmly. "That's the right call," he said. "A lot of people put the main room north and spend their whole lives in a cold kitchen." "I've read enough about it to know the difference," she said. "I can see that." He picked up his hat where he had set it on a fence post and put it back on. "You need anything else, I'm a mile east." "Thank you, Mr. Brenner," she said, and meant it without allowing it to be too much. He touched the brim of his hat and rode away. That night, in her small room at Mrs. Fitch's boarding house, Minnie lay awake longer than usual, which she attributed entirely to the excitement of the construction beginning in earnest. She was not lying awake thinking about a man with brown eyes and quiet patience. She was absolutely not doing that. She was in Dust Creek. She was building something real. That was everything. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most satisfying of Minnie's life. She hired a local man named Pete Garrett, who was known to be a solid hand at carpentry, to help her raise the frame and roof, and she worked alongside him from first light to late afternoon every day, learning as she went, her muscles aching in ways she had not known muscles could ache. She learned to set a square joint, to pack stone, to mix mortar to the right consistency, to estimate load. She read by lamplight in the evenings from a dog-eared copy of a homesteading manual she had brought from St. Louis, annotating it with her own observations. Mrs. Fitch, who had grown fond of Minnie in the unsentimental way of practical women who recognize each other, sometimes sat with her on the boarding house porch in the evening and listened to her talk through problems. "You're going to kill yourself with work," Mrs. Fitch observed one evening mildly. "I'm going to build a house," Minnie corrected. "Same thing some days." Mrs. Fitch rocked slowly. "Milton Brenner came by the store today, I heard. Asked Hadley if your supply order had come through." Minnie looked at her needlework. She had taken to doing small needlework in the evenings to rest her hands without resting her mind. "Did he?" Mrs. Fitch rocked. "He has been helpful," Minnie said, carefully neutral. "Neighborly." "He's a good man," Mrs. Fitch said. "Lost his father 2 years ago. Runs that spread alone. Works harder than most men I've known." She paused, not much given to talking about himself. "That's a virtue in most people," Minnie said. "Some people mistake it for coldness," Mrs. Fitch said. "It isn't." Minnie made a stitch. "Mrs. Fitch, I appreciate what you're—" "I'm not doing anything," Mrs. Fitch said innocently. "Just rocking." Minnie did not bring it up again. Milton appeared at the property twice more in the following weeks. Once to warn her that a dry thunderstorm was coming from the northwest, and that the new roof frame should be weighted down or braced against the wind before it hit. Information that turned out to be correct, and that she was deeply grateful for. And once to bring her a fence-post driver that she had been planning to rent from the livery, but that he owned outright and was not using. Both times he stayed only as long as was practical, helped in the specific way he had come to help, and left without lingering. She began to notice that he never overstepped, never offered more than she seemed to want, never pushed through any door she had not opened. She found this deeply difficult to ignore. She also found that she had started to notice things about him that had nothing to do with lumber or fence posts. The way he spoke to his horse while he worked, in a low, continuous murmur, as though the animal were an old friend he was catching up with. The way he listened when she explained what she was trying to do, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening, his eyes on her face, taking it in. The way he laughed, which was rare enough to be worth noticing when it happened, a real laugh, with real warmth in it, not the polite social variety. One afternoon in late July, a full 6 weeks after she had arrived in Dusk Creek, Minnie was working on the stone chimney, a task that was harder and more technically demanding than anything she had yet attempted, when she hit a problem she could not solve alone. The capstone she was trying to set was simply too heavy to be lifted and positioned by one person without a second pair of hands to hold it steady while the mortar was set. She stood and looked at the stone for a long time. She thought about riding back to town and getting Pete Garrett. She thought about whether there was a mechanical solution using the fence post driver as a lever. She thought about waiting until tomorrow. Then she thought about Milton Brenner, 1 mile east, and she felt the deep, familiar resistance rise up inside her, followed by a very different feeling that was more complicated and less comfortable. She needed help. She was not going to let pride about needing help be the thing that kept her from building her chimney. She rode to his property. It was the first time she had seen his spread up close. It was modest but well-kept, a solid-looking barn, a good fenced line, a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that someone was tending with care. The house itself was small but sturdy, built with the kind of patient attention that meant it would stand for a generation. Milton was in the corral with a young horse, working a lunge line in patient circles. He saw her coming and let the horse wind down, then came to the fence. "Miss Redmond," he said, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite categorize, not surprise exactly, but something more like quiet attention, as though she had walked into a room he had not been sure she would ever enter. "I have a capstone that I need a second pair of hands to set," she said. "I would pay you for your time." He looked at her for a moment. "No charge," he said. "Give me 5 minutes to get the horse sorted." She wanted to insist on payment, but something in her understood that they had moved past the lumber transaction, and that insisting again would be its own kind of rudeness. "All right," she said. He came with her to the property and helped her set the capstone without drama or fuss, holding it level while she worked the mortar around it, the two of them working in the close, careful silence of people concentrating on something precise and physical. When it was done and she stepped back to look, the chimney was solid and clean and exactly what she had intended. "That's well built," Milton said, looking at it. He was not offering empty compliments. She could hear that in his voice. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was late afternoon and the light was going copper and strange the way it did at that hour, and because she had been working since dawn and was tired in a way that had loosened some of her usual careful composure, she said, "You've been very kind. I don't think I've said that plainly enough." He looked at her. "You thanked me every time," he said. "That's not the same thing as saying it plainly." It was quiet for a moment, and then something around his eyes softened very slightly, and he said, "You're welcome, Miss Redmond, plainly." She felt something shift inside her, like a door opening just a crack, and she immediately wanted to close it again. She gathered her tools. "I'll get supper started," she said. "There's still some soup at Mrs. Fitch's from this morning." He nodded, but as she was walking to her horse, he said, "Miss Redmond." She turned. "I know you came here to do this alone," he said. "I'm not trying to get in the way of that." She looked at him standing in the amber light of the late afternoon, and for a moment she could not speak, because no one, not one single person, had ever said that to her. They had worried about her, or admired her, or doubted her, but no one had simply seen what she was doing and told her they understood it. "I know," she said finally. "I can see that." She rode back to town. She lay awake for a long time. She told herself it was the chimney she was thinking about, and whether the mortar had been packed densely enough around the capstone, and what the weather would be like in the morning. She was absolutely telling herself this very hard. The house was livable by the beginning of August. It was small, a main room with the kitchen and a fireplace, one bedroom, and a linta for storing tools. But it was solid and it was hers. And the day she moved her trunk in from Mrs. Fitch's and set her mother's small porcelain teapot on the window ledge and made a fire in the chimney she had built with her own hands, she cried a little, quietly. With the particular satisfaction of someone who has worked for something so long and so hard that the achievement carries the weight of every difficult hour inside it. Mrs. Fitch came out with a jar of preserved peaches and a warm quilt as a housewarming gift, and Minnie accepted both with genuine gratitude. "You did it," Mrs. Fitch said, looking around the main room. "I did it," Minnie said. She had her first harvest that fall, not a full harvest, because she had planted late and the season was short, but enough. Winter wheat in the east field and a kitchen garden that had come in better than she expected. She sold what she could spare at the Dust Creek Market Day, which happened twice a month, and used the money to buy a second-hand milk cow she named Patience, because she needed patience, and a small flock of chickens. Milton came to the market too, because most of the ranchers in the area did. Dust Creek's Market Day was the social hinge of the whole region. People came from 12, 15, sometimes 20 miles to sell and buy and catch up on news. She saw him across the square on the first market day she attended, deep in conversation with a tall man she later learned was his friend and neighboring rancher, a weathered veteran of the cattle drives named Samuel Holt. Milton caught her eye across the square and raised a hand in greeting, and she nodded back, and that was that. But later in the day, when the sun had passed its peak and the crowds had thinned and she was counting her sales with quiet satisfaction, she had sold all of her winter wheat flour, ground at the town mill, and half her eggs. He appeared beside her stall with 2 cups of coffee from the cookfire that the Hadley family ran on market days. "Coffee," he offered. She looked at the cups and then at him. "Thank you," she said, and took one. They stood there for a while, drinking their coffee in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had by now accumulated enough small, practical experiences of each other that silence was not awkward. Around them, Dust Creek hummed with the sounds of livestock and commerce and people catching up on 2 weeks of living. "Good market?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said. "Wheat came in well," he said. It was not quite a question. He had seen her fields from his property, which sat on somewhat higher ground, and she knew he had watched them. "It did," she said. "I think next year I can double the acreage if the winter is reasonable." He nodded. "You'll want to think about a second plow horse by spring. One horse is fine for a small field, but if you're doubling acreage, you'll want two in tandem." She had already thought about this. "I know," she said. "I've been looking at what horses are available in the county. There's a man named Johansson about 40 miles north, breeds good working horses," Milton said. "Not expensive, solid animals." "I'll write to him," she said. Milton wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked out over the square, and she found herself looking at his hands for a moment, large, capable hands, scarred in the way that all working hands were, brown from the sun. She looked away. "How are you finding it out there?" he asked. "Alone. I like it," she said without hesitation. "I like the quiet." "It can get very quiet," he said, and there was something in his voice that was matter of fact and also, she thought, a little honest. "Does it bother you?" she asked. She had not meant to ask a personal question. It came out anyway. He was quiet for a moment. "Some nights," he said. "Not most." She nodded. "Same," she said. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said to anyone in months. She was not sure what to do with the feeling of having said it, so she finished her coffee, thanked him, and busied herself packing up her stall for the ride home. October came with its particular beauty, the mesa-turning colors she had not expected to see in this part of Texas, the sky deepening to an evening blue that seemed to go on forever, the nights cold enough to require the heavy quilt Mrs. Fitch had given her. Minnie had settled into her days with a rhythm she loved. Early mornings with the animals, the middle of the day on whatever project needed doing, fence repairs, wood splitting, preparing the winter garden, canning and preserving, and evenings with a book or her needlework, the lamp warm on the table, Patience the cow settled in her stall. It was a good life. It was exactly what she had come here to build. The problem was that she found herself thinking about Milton Brenner at odd moments throughout the day, and she was becoming increasingly annoyed with herself about it. She thought about him when she checked the chimney mortar and it held perfectly. She thought about him when she looked east and could see, on clear days, the smoke from his own chimney rising above the line of the low hills. She thought about him on the evenings that were particularly quiet in the way he had described, a specific, deep quiet that was both peaceful and pointed, like a finger indicating an absence. She thought about the way he had said, simply and without drama, "I know you came here to do this alone." She thought about his hands around the coffee cup. She went to town one Friday to pick up a letter she was expecting from the county land office, and found herself in Hadley's at the same time as Milton, who was buying fence wire and a new bridle. They ended up walking out of the store at the same time, and he offered to carry her supplies to her horse, and she let him, and they stood in the autumn afternoon outside the store and talked for nearly an hour about things that had nothing to do with lumber or fence posts or chimney mortar, about books. It turned out, because she had mentioned the homesteading manual, and he had asked what else she read, and it turned out he read too, which she had not expected. Not because she thought poorly of him, but because she had not let herself learn enough about him to know. He read history mostly, and some philosophy, a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius that had belonged to his father. She read everything she could get her hands on. They talked about it with the particular pleasure of two people who both love something and do not usually get to talk about it with anyone, and the afternoon light moved across the street and the horses waited patiently, and neither of them quite noticed the time going. When she finally caught herself, she felt a flush of something embarrassment, or something more honest than embarrassment, and said she needed to get back before dark. "Of course," he said. He loaded her supplies onto her horse with the easy efficiency she had come to associate with him. He helped her up without making a production of it. And then just before she touched her heels to the horse's sides, he looked up at her and said, "Miss Redmond, I don't know what your plans are, but I wonder if you'd take supper with me sometime. It doesn't have to be anything, just a meal." She looked at him. She thought about her promise to herself. She thought about Ruth, her neighbor in St. Louis, who had loved a man and lost everything. She thought about her mother, broken by love's absence. She thought about all the reasons she had come here alone and intended to stay that way. "I don't have any intention of," she started, and then stopped, because the words felt oddly unfinished when she tried to apply them to this particular man on this particular afternoon. "Of what?" he asked, not unkindly. "Of falling in love," she said directly, because she had always been direct even when it was uncomfortable. "I came here to build a life, not to fall in love with anyone." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not hurt exactly, but something that was honest and a little wry and also, she thought, deeply personal. And then he said quietly, "Neither did I." She waited. "Look at us now," he said. And then, before she could respond, he stepped back and touched the brim of his hat, and she rode away. And she did not let herself look back. And she rode the whole mile home with her heart beating at a rate that had absolutely nothing to do with the horse's pace. She did not sleep at all that night. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling beams of the house she had built with her own hands, and she thought about what he had said, and what she had said, and what it all amounted to. She thought about him riding to her property to warn her about the dry thunderstorm, and bringing her the planks, and holding the capstone steady while the mortar set, and listening to her talk about her plans with real, attentive interest, and standing in the October afternoon talking about Marcus Aurelius with the relaxed pleasure of a man who had finally found someone worth talking to. She thought about the way he had said, "Neither did I," and look at us now without flinching, without prettifying it, without performing anything, just saying the plain truth of it and then stepping back and giving her the choice. He was giving her the choice. She was not accustomed to being given choices by men. She was accustomed to being presented with conclusions and expected to accept them. This was something different. She thought about it for a very long time. She thought about the genuine satisfaction she had found in her solitary life, and it was genuine. She would not lie to herself about that. She loved the land, loved the quiet, loved the particular pride of having built something with her own hands. She did not want to lose any of that. But she had somehow, somewhere in the months of knowing Milton Brenner by small, practical degrees, started to feel something that she had not intended to feel and could no longer convincingly deny, at 3 in the morning in the dark of a house that was unquestionably hers and was also, some evenings, very quiet. In the morning, she made her decision. She saddled her horse after breakfast and rode east. Milton was splitting wood behind his barn when she arrived. He looked up and something in his face became very still and very attentive, and she appreciated that he did not pretend he wasn't surprised to see her. "Supper," she said, from the saddle. "Sunday, I'll cook. Come at 6. He set the axe down. "All right," he said. "I'm not promising anything else," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "All right," he said again, and the steadiness of it, the complete absence of any pressure or assumption in his voice was, she thought, probably the thing that had gotten her here. She rode back home and immediately began worrying about what to cook, which was not the kind of thing she usually worried about and which told her something. She made a good supper. Roasted chicken, one of her own with root vegetables, and a loaf of bread from flour she had ground herself, and a dried apple pie that came out better than she had expected. She set the table properly, with her mother's 2 good china plates that she had wrapped in wool the whole journey from St. Louis, and the small lamp in the center, and a jar of dried wildflowers she had collected from the mesa because she happened to have them. Milton arrived at 6 exactly, and he had combed his hair and changed his shirt and brought a small jar of wild honey he had gotten from a man in town who kept bees, and he looked at the table and the food and said, "This is a real supper, Miss Redmond." "Minnie," she said, because she had decided. He looked at her and that warmth moved through his eyes again. "Milton," he said. They had supper. They talked. It was, and she would think about this later, in the way she thought carefully about everything entirely natural. Not easy in the sense of requiring no effort, but natural in the sense of feeling like something that was supposed to be happening, like a river, finding the course it was always meant to take. They talked about the county and the land and the weather and the market, and then they talked about his father and her mother, and how they had both come to this part of Texas, and what they thought about staying. And then somehow, without planning it, they talked about loneliness, not with drama or self-pity, but with the matter-of-fact honesty of two people who had both spent a long time being alone and had learned how to speak about it plainly. "My father always said a man needs a reason to come inside at the end of the day," Milton said. He was looking at the lamp, and his voice was quiet. "Just the walls and the work," he said, "that wasn't enough eventually. I thought he was wrong for a long time. And now," she asked. He looked at her. "I think he was right." She felt the warmth of that in her chest and did not push it away. He helped her clear the table afterward without being asked, which she noticed. He stacked the plates the way someone who knew how to care for things stacked plates. He picked up his hat at the door and said good night, and there was a pause before he went out, the kind of pause that is full of something, and then he said, "Thank you, Minnie." "Thank you for coming," she said. He rode away into the dark, and she watched the lamp of his lantern bob in the distance until she couldn't see it anymore. She smiled, standing in the doorway of her house, and then laughed a little at herself, and went inside. November came in on a cold wind. The first frost hit on the 12th, which was not unusual for that part of Texas, and Minnie spent the better part of 3 days protecting her winter garden and making sure Patience the cow and the chickens were properly sheltered. There was a particular satisfaction to being ahead of the weather, to having prepared well enough that the cold was a condition to be managed rather than a crisis. She and Milton fell into a rhythm of seeing each other that felt very natural and very deliberate at the same time. Supper on Sundays, alternating between her place and his, and then gradually, over the weeks, other smaller occasions. He would come by on a Wednesday afternoon if he was riding past and stop to water his horse and end up staying for coffee, or she would ride over to tell him something she had read about a new wheat variety that might do well in this soil, and end up staying longer than intended. They were both aware of what was happening, and neither of them was pretending otherwise, but neither of them was rushing it either. One Sunday evening at his place, he made a stew that was surprisingly good. He had clearly been cooking for himself long enough to know what he was doing, and after supper, he read her a passage from his father's copy of Marcus Aurelius that he said he had been thinking about, and she told him what she thought about it, and they argued pleasantly about it for a while, and she felt, with the particular vividness that important moments sometimes have, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was washing the supper dishes in his kitchen. He had protested this. She had told him firmly that she had made him do the same at her place, and it was only fair when he came and stood in the kitchen doorway with his coffee and watched her for a moment and said, "Minnie," she said, "I think you know how I feel about you," he said. "I want to say it because I think you deserve to hear it said plain." She kept her hands in the wash water. "Say it then," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I don't expect you to have the same feeling, and I don't expect anything from it. I just want you to know." She was quiet for a moment. The wash water was warm against her hands. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like whispered conversation. She turned around, drying her hands on the cloth, and looked at him standing in the doorway with his coffee cup and his honest face. "I came here with absolutely no intention of falling in love with anyone," she said. "I want you to know that's true." "I know," he said. "And I'm in love with you," she said plainly. "I've been trying not to be for some time, and it turns out that doesn't work." The warmth that moved through his face then was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a person's face. He set his coffee cup down on the side table and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the particular way he was looking at her, which was with the total, unhurried attention of someone who has found something very precious and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He kissed her, and it was, she had no other word for it, right. In the way that a capstone finally set in mortar is right, holding everything it was always meant to hold. Winter settled over Dusk Creek with cold nights and pale days, and wood smoke rising from every chimney in the valley. Minnie and Milton were, by the town's understanding, courting. Mrs. Fitch knew because she knew everything. Samuel Holt knew because Milton had told him, and Samuel had apparently told his wife, and Dusk Creek being the size it was, the information had distributed itself with the efficiency of a well-organized postal system. Minnie found she did not mind. She had not come here to hide. They spent Christmas Day together at her place. She cooked the dinner, which was a good one, and he brought the honey again and also a small gift, a thick, good-quality almanac for the coming year, full of soil and weather information she would actually use, which she thought was possibly the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given her, and she told him so. "I thought about flowers," he said, "but you'd enjoy this more." "I would," she agreed. He had another gift, too, a small wrapped thing that he set on the table with a slight air of uncertainty that she had not seen from him before and that she found endearing. "I made this," he said. "It might not be well, open it." She unwrapped it. It was a small carved wooden box made from what looked like walnut with a simple pattern carved into the lid, a pattern of prairie grass and a single climbing vine. The work was careful and patient and very beautiful. "Milton," she said. "I carve sometimes in the evenings," he said. "My father taught me." She held the box and looked at it and then looked at him. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it with her whole self. He reached out and briefly, gently covered her hand with his. January brought a hard freeze that lasted for 10 days and tested every structure in the valley. Minnie's house held well. She had built it solidly. She kept the fire going around the clock and bundled patients and the chickens against the cold. And she and Milton checked on each other's properties in the worst of it, riding the mile between through cold that hit the face like a flat hand. On the 4th night of the freeze, the temperature dropped sharply enough that she was genuinely concerned about the pipes in her water system, and she rode to Milton's to borrow a specific type of insulating wrap he had mentioned having. He sent her back with the wrap and also with a pot of hot soup and a look of such frank concern that she had to tell him firmly she was fine. "I know you're fine," he said. "Take the soup." She took the soup. February, and the freeze broke and the land came back to itself, tentatively at first and then with the decisive rush of a season that has been waiting. Minnie began her spring planning in earnest, mapping out the doubled acreage she intended to plant in wheat, calculating seed amounts, writing to the man named Johansson about the workhorses Milton had mentioned. The reply came back that he had 2 good mares available, well suited to field work, at a price she could manage with what she had saved from the fall market. Milton offered to ride with her to Johansson's farm to look at the horses. 40 miles was a 2-day ride, and she had not wanted to make it alone, though she would have if necessary. She said yes to his company without the usual internal negotiation, which she noticed. They rode north on a bright, cold March morning, camping the first night beside a creek bed that still carried ice along its edges. They built a fire and ate from the provisions Minnie had packed, and sat on opposite sides of the fire in the comfortable way of people who trust each other completely, talking as the night settled around them, and the stars came out over the mesa in the particular blazing abundance that was one of the great gifts of living this far from any city. "Do you ever think about going back?" Milton asked. He was looking at the fire. "To St. Louis." She thought about it seriously, because he was asking seriously. "No, this is home now." She looked at the land around them, dark and enormous and alive in the way that night in open country is alive. "I didn't know I was looking for home when I came here. But this is it." He looked at her across the fire. "Same," he said. She smiled. "You're from Texas originally." "Born 60 miles east of here," he said. Came to this county with my father when I was 14, but it's one thing to live somewhere and another to feel like it's yours. When did it start feeling like yours? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when I wasn't lonely in it anymore. She felt the warmth of that settle into her like the heat of the fire, and she looked back at the stars, and she did not say anything, because some things don't need a response. They just need to be held. They got the horses from Johansson, 2 solid, quiet mares who Minnie named March and April in honor of the month she acquired them, and rode south with the new horses on lead lines, and it was, Minnie thought, one of the finer journeys she had ever made. Milton told her things about the country they were riding through, the history of different settlements, a story about a cattle drive that had gone through this valley 10 years earlier that was both funny and a little harrowing, and she told him about things she had read, and they talked and were quiet and talked again, and she thought about how rare it was to have someone who was comfortable in both, the talking and the quiet. Spring planting consumed April entirely. Minnie was up before dawn every morning and in the fields until the light gave out, and Milton was the same on his own property, and they saw each other less during this period, but each knew what the other was doing and why, and there was something deeply companionable about that, the parallel diligence of two people building their own things side by side. But on a Sunday evening in late April, he came over for supper and sat across from her at the table with something in his manner that was different from his usual settled calm. Not nervous, exactly, but careful, as though he were carrying something fragile. They had eaten and the dishes were done, and she was making tea, and she said, because she had learned to read him well enough to know when something needed saying, "What is it?" He looked at her. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something small on the table between them. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small oval setting of dark green stone. "That was my mother's," he said. "She left it to my father, and he left it to me, and he said to give it to someone worth giving it to." Minnie looked at the ring and then at him and felt something so large and so certain move through her that, for a moment, she could not speak. "I'm asking you to marry me, Minnie," he said. "Not because I think you need anyone, because you clearly don't. And not because I think you can't do everything you've built here alone, because you clearly can. I'm asking because I love you, and I want to build everything from here together, and I hope, that you want that too." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Dust Creek with $40 and a satchel and a solemn promise to need no one. She thought about how that woman had been right about a great many things and wrong about one. "Yes," she said. He released a breath that told her how much he had been holding, and she reached across the table and took his hand, and he looked at her with everything he was, all of it, warm and clear and present, and it was the most seen she had ever felt in her life. He put the ring on her finger. The green stone caught the lamplight and held it. They were married in June, in the leaning steepled church of Dust Creek, with Mrs. Fitch beaming in the front pew and Samuel Holt standing up for Milton and Pete Garrett in attendance with his wife and 2 small children, and most of the county that could make the ride, because Dust Creek was a small community and a wedding was an event. The minister was a red-faced, earnest man named Reverend Crouch, who delivered the ceremony with great feeling. Minnie wore her best dress, which she had altered herself, a deep blue that she had always loved and that Mrs. Fitch declared was exactly right. Her hair was down, something she rarely did, and she had put a small arrangement of wildflowers from the mesa in it. She walked up the aisle of the little church, and Milton turned from the altar and saw her, and the expression on his face was the kind of expression that does not need any words around it. They exchanged vows. When Reverend Crouch said, in the well-worn language of the ceremony, that 2 people joined together in love, Minnie thought about what a strange and unplannable thing love was, how it had arrived in spite of her best reasoning, through the side door of small practical kindnesses and quiet conversations and the patient company of a man who had given her every choice. She had no intention of falling in love, she had told him, And he had told her simply, "Neither did I look at us now." After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the square. Dusk Creek knew how to celebrate. Someone had a fiddle and someone else had a guitar, and the dancing went until well past dark. And Minnie danced with Milton and with Samuel Holt out of politeness, and with Mrs. Fitch's 16-year-old nephew because he asked very earnestly. And she laughed in a way she had not laughed in years, free and full, in the warm June night with the stars overhead. Later, riding home together to what was now their home, they had decided to live at Minnie's place, which was closer to the fields and had the better-built chimney, and to use Milton's property for the cattle he ran. She was quiet and very happy. The kind of happy that is also very calm because it is not excitement or relief but something more like arrival. "Well," she said, riding beside him through the night. "Well," he agreed. "Here we are," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand briefly, a warm, certain grip, and then let go so they could both manage their horses on the dark road. "Here we are," he said. Life in the years that followed was full and hard and genuinely good, in the way that things which cost real effort are genuinely good. They farmed the land together, Minnie's primary domain, which she continued to run with the systematic intelligence she had brought to it from the beginning, with Milton's labor added to hers in the seasons that required it. They ran cattle on his spread, which was Milton's primary domain, though Minnie had opinions about the cattle too, and Milton had long since learned that her opinions were generally worth listening to. Their first winter as a married couple taught them a great deal about each other that courtship had not, simply because the daily intimacy of sharing a home and a life reveals things that Sunday suppers do not. They had arguments, real ones, occasionally, about decisions and priorities, and the particular friction that comes of two very independent, opinionated people trying to make common ground. But they had also developed, through months of honest conversation and the practice of saying difficult things plainly, a vocabulary for those arguments that generally kept them from becoming anything more than what they were. One evening in their first February together, they had a sharp disagreement about whether to invest in a new piece of equipment, a seed drill that Minnie had read about and believed would significantly improve her planting efficiency, but that was expensive enough to require careful consideration. Milton had concerns about the timing, given that they had just had an unexpected expense with one of the mares going lame. Minnie felt the timing was exactly right, that delaying would cost them a season. The argument was thorough, and at one point, had an edge to it that made both of them quiet for a while afterward. Then Milton put his coffee down and said, "Tell me again why you think this spring and not next," she told him. He listened, actually listened, going through the reasoning with her point by point. Then he said, "If we sell the 2 steers we were going to hold until summer, we can free up enough to cover it without the risk." She had not thought of that particular solution, and she said so, and he did not make anything of it, and they ordered the seed drill. The seed drill was absolutely the right decision. That spring's wheat planting was faster and more even than anything they had achieved before, and the yield that fall was the best the property had ever produced. Their son, James, was born in the spring of 1881, arriving with considerable determination and volume, which Milton said told you everything you needed to know about him. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and he was, both of them agreed privately and occasionally in public, an extraordinary child, though they tried not to say this too loudly on the grounds that it would go to his head. Minnie had thought during her pregnancy about what it would be like to not be the sole ruler of her own time and energy, because a child by necessity changes that equation completely. She had thought she might resist it. She did not. What she found instead was something that caught her entirely by surprise, a love that was different from any other love she had known, not more or less than the love she had for Milton, but differently shaped, immediate and physical and boundless in a way that reorganized everything around it. Milton was, from the first day, a father with the same quality he brought to everything: steady, patient, completely present. She watched him with James and felt something that she could not quite name, some compound of love and gratitude, and the particular happiness of seeing someone you love be exactly themselves in a new context. James was followed, 3 years later, by a daughter they named Eleanor, after Milton's mother, and she was very different from her brother. Where James was loud and immediate and physical, Eleanor was quiet and observant and possessed of an intelligence that expressed itself in long silences followed by statements that stopped whatever conversation was happening and made the adults look at each other. "She's like you," Milton told Minnie. "She's better than me," Minnie said, watching their 4-year-old daughter carefully examine a beetle with the focused attention of a natural philosopher. "I don't think that's possible," Milton said. She looked at him. "Don't say things like that." "I'll say them as often as I like," he said. "We've been married 7 years and I've earned the right to say true things." She tried not to smile and failed. There were difficulties, too, in those years. In 1883, a drought hit the county that was the worst in 20 years, and the wheat harvest failed almost entirely. Minnie and Milton, like everyone in the region, spent a tense and careful winter managing their resources and making the hard calculations of what to sell, what to keep, what to wait on. Milton sold half the cattle, a painful decision made cleanly, without lingering on it, and Minnie sold what stores she had saved, and they stretched what remained with the careful, daily inventiveness that hard times require. What got them through was partly their own practical competence and partly the community of Dust Creek, which turned out, in hard times, to be the thing it had always quietly been, a collection of people who helped each other because that was the only workable approach to survival in this country. Mrs. Fitch organized a community store of basic goods. Samuel Holt brought cattle feed to 3 neighboring families who had none. The Hadley family extended credit generously and with grace. Milton and Minnie were both the givers and receivers of this kind of help, and Minnie thought, that winter, about how wrong she had been to think that building a life meant building it alone. You built it with the people around you. That was the only way any building lasted. The drought broke the following spring, and the rains came back, and the land came back with it, and the summer of 1884 was so abundantly green that it almost seemed like the land was apologizing. That summer, Milton came home one evening from a visit to town looking thoughtful. He sat at the supper table while she finished cooking and was quiet in his deliberate way, not troubled. She had learned to distinguish, but considering. "What?" she asked, setting the pot on the table. "There's going to be a railroad survey through the county," he said, looking at the route options. "If it comes south of town rather than north, it goes right through the edge of the Holt property and along the creek that borders ours." She understood immediately what this meant: access to markets that currently required expensive long-haul freight, the potential to sell grain and cattle at significantly better prices. She also understood what it meant for the land, for the quiet she had built her life inside. "That's complicated," she said. "Yes," he said. They talked about it for a long time that evening and over the following weeks, and at community meetings where the county had very strong opinions in every direction. Minnie found herself in the position of being both enthusiastic about the economic possibilities and genuinely uncertain about what it would change. She articulated this at a town meeting where everyone else seemed to have committed entirely to one side or the other, and the room was briefly quiet, and then the discussion became more nuanced, which she thought was probably an improvement. The railroad eventually came, not through their property but north of town, which resolved the most personal of Minnie and Milton's concerns while still giving them access to improved shipping routes for their grain. It was the kind of compromise that life in a community almost always produces, not what anyone exactly planned, but workable. James grew into a boy who was all energy and question, who could not pass a piece of ground without wanting to know what was under it, and could not encounter a horse without trying to understand it. By the time he was 6, He was following Milton around the cattle operation with the focused attention of an apprentice. And Milton answered every question with the patient thoroughness of a man who genuinely loved both the subject and the questioner. Eleanor, at 4, was already a reader, which had surprised no one who knew her parents. Minnie found her one morning with a seed catalog, working her way through it with her finger moving under each word, having apparently taught herself somewhere between the previous night and that morning that letters made sounds and sounds made words. "Where did you learn that?" Minnie asked, crouching beside her. Eleanor looked up with the perfectly serious expression she wore as her default. "I worked it out," she said. Minnie looked at her daughter and felt a love that contained everything. This child, this house, this land, this life that she had built first alone and then together, and was better for the together than she would have believed possible. In the autumn of 1885, 7 years after Minnie had stepped off the stagecoach into the dust of Dusk Creek with her $40 and her solemn promise, she and Milton walked the south field in the late afternoon light. The wheat had been harvested, and the field was golden stubble as far as they could see, and the mesas were burning copper in the distance, and the air had that particular October quality of being cold and clear, and somehow both ending and beginning at the same time. She had her hand in his as they walked, which was a thing she had gotten used to over the years without it ever becoming unremarkable. His hand was warm and familiar, and she could feel the calluses she knew as well as her own. "You know what I was thinking about today," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The day you brought me those planks," she said, "with the bay pack horse, I was so determined to pay you for them." He laughed, the real laugh, the one she loved. "You gave me $1 for my trouble. It was less than your trouble was worth, and we both knew it." "I thought it was very fair," he said, "all things considered." She looked at the field. "I told you I was going to do all of this alone," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I had absolutely no intention of falling in love," she said. She looked at him, and he was looking at her with the warm, settled attention that was. She had come to understand just how he looked at her, always, the same way he had looked at her on that first October day in front of Hadley's store when she had told him exactly that. "Neither did I," he said. "Look at us now," she said. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and she looked at him, at the lines that had deepened at the corners of his eyes and the gray that had begun at his temples and the face that was, and would always be, the most familiar and beloved face she knew. And he kissed her in the middle of the harvested field, briefly and warmly, and with all 7 years of their life in it. They walked on, and the light went gold and then red over the mesa, and somewhere behind them the house sat solid and chimney upright and full, and ahead of them was everything they were still going to do. Spring came again the following year with its muddy urgency, and Minnie planted the south and east fields with a variety of winter wheat she had been studying since the previous summer, a more drought-resistant strain that had been developed and circulated among farmers in the county through the agricultural cooperative she had helped establish 2 years earlier, in the aftermath of the drought. The cooperative, a simple, practical arrangement by which the farmers of the county shared information, seeds, and tools, had been her idea, worked out in conversation with Samuel Holt's wife, a smart woman named Dora who had run her family's farm through 3 years of her husband's illness and knew what she was talking about. The cooperative had grown to include 14 families by 1886, and it had already made a measurable difference in how the county as a whole managed bad seasons and good ones. Milton had been the first to say, when she had proposed it, that it was a good idea. He had also said, "You should run it." "I don't need to run everything," she said. "You're good at it," he said simply. She ran it. James, at 5, had developed a particular attachment to the dappled gray horse that had been Milton's since before Minnie had known him. The horse was old now but still going, a horse of remarkable dignity and apparent self-possession. James called him Cloud, which was not his official name, and Cloud tolerated James's presence and even his occasional well-meaning climbing attempts with a patience that seemed almost philosophical. "Cloud's going to outlive all of us out of sheer stubbornness," Minnie said one morning, watching James and the horse regard each other across the fence. "I hope so," Milton said. Eleanor, at 7, had written her first letter entirely by herself. A letter to the land office in Austin requesting information about soil surveys in Dusk Creek County, which she said she needed for a project she was conducting. The land office had responded, presumably because the letter was so precise and polite that they had not realized it was from a child. Minnie had read it and felt such a combination of amusement and pride that she had had to go outside and stand in the yard for a moment. One evening in the late summer of 1886, after supper, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet in the way it was when the day had been full, Minnie sat on the porch with her needlework and Milton sat beside her on the step with his coffee and his book, and neither of them was talking. The prairie stretched out to the dark and the stars were coming in, and from somewhere nearby a cricket was conducting a one-insect symphony. "Are you happy?" Milton asked, not in an anxious way, but in the way he sometimes asked things simply because he wanted to know. She looked at her needlework. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said, "genuinely. In every important way." "Good," he said. "Are you?" she asked. He looked out at the dark land that was also, in some real sense, theirs, the wheat fields to the south, the cattle on his spread to the east, the well-built house behind them, the children sleeping inside it. "Yes," he said, with the certainty of a man who has examined the question and found his answer solid. She took his hand and held it and went back to her needlework, and he went back to his book, and the cricket continued its performance, and the stars were extraordinary, and the night was warm, and it was exactly enough. Their third child arrived in 1888, another boy they named Thomas, who came into the world with the same decisive volume as James, but who settled quickly into a sweet-natured, round-cheeked presence that made the household seem to find a new level of warmth. James, now 7, received his brother with the benevolent interest of someone who has been given an interesting new project. Eleanor, at 9, received him with a seriousness that suggested she was already formulating plans for his education. Minnie recovered well from Thomas's birth, though it was slower than the first two, and Milton took on the household without being asked, cooking and managing the children and the animals with the calm competence she had always loved in him. He brought her tea in the mornings and read aloud to her in the evenings from whatever book she chose, and he was there every time she opened her eyes, steady and warm, without drama or complaint. "You don't have to do all of this," she told him, one morning toward the end of the second week. "I want to," he said. It was the same simple voice he had used when he had offered her the leftover planks in the first year. Not performing generosity, just being it. She looked at him, properly, the way she had not looked at anything in a few weeks of recovery, and felt the full weight of what she had been given in this man and this life, and it moved through her with the force of something enormous and quiet. "I know," she said. "Thank you." He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand and looked at her and said nothing, and it was more than enough. Dusk Creek changed over those years, as towns in the West were changing everywhere in that decade. The railroad had brought more people, and more people had brought more commerce, and more commerce had brought a new school, which Minnie had campaigned for along with Dora Holt and 3 other women in the county, writing letters to the county education office with the patient persistence of people who know that eventually the right answer wins. The school opened in 1887, and James started attending that fall, walking the 1.5 miles to town with the children of neighboring homesteads in a cheerful group that left every morning with a level of noise that put the birds up off the fences. Eleanor went the following year, and the schoolteacher, a young man named Mr. Greaves, just out of normal school in Austin, took one look at her work in the first week and came to speak with Minnie with an expression of mild astonishment. "Your daughter," he said carefully, "is ahead of everything I have planned for this year." "I'm aware," Minnie said. "I'll need to think about how to—" he started. "She'll manage," Minnie said. "She always does, but if you can find her harder problems, she'll be grateful." he found her harder problems. Eleanor was, in fact, grateful and responded by becoming the schoolteacher's most engaged student, which Minnie suspected was also occasionally his most challenging one. The agricultural cooperative continued to grow. By 1889, it included 22 families and had developed into something substantial enough that it had formalized its structure and elected officers. Minnie served as secretary, a role that involved a great deal of letter writing and record-keeping, and suited her organizational intelligence exactly. She was frequently the one who drafted the letters to the County Agricultural Extension Office, the seed suppliers, the equipment manufacturers, and the county commissioners when the cooperative needed something from government. She had a talent for it, for the precise, clear, persuasive letter that got the thing done. Milton, who was by 1889 a respected figure in the county's ranching community, was the one people came to when they needed a practical assessment of cattle-related problems. He had the knowledge and the manner for it, the patience to listen, and the honesty to say what he actually thought. He had taken on a hand that year, a young man of 19 named Robbie Kane, who was hardworking and good with horses, and who ate supper with them twice a week and had, in the way of young people who are looking for something solid to learn from, latched onto Milton with the earnest attention of an apprentice. Minnie liked Robbie. He reminded her in some ways of herself at a younger age, the same quality of independence, of having had to figure things out without much help, of wanting to make something real with his hands. "He's going to want his own spread in a few years," she told Milton one evening. "I know," Milton said. "Good. You don't mind?" He looked at her. "Of course not. You teach people so they can go do things. That's the point." She thought about that, about the school and the cooperative and the things they had built, and the way Dusk Creek itself had grown from a raw, lean collection of people on hard land into something that had depth and history in it now, something that had accumulated enough shared experience to be genuinely a community. She had come here to build something real. She had built more than she had imagined. One evening in the autumn of 1889, 11 years after Minnie had stepped off the stagecoach, she was sitting at the kitchen table going through the cooperative's accounts when Milton came in from outside with his hat in his hand and a smile she couldn't quite read. "Come outside," he said. She set down her pen. "Why?" "I want to show you something." She followed him out into the evening. He led her around to the south side of the house, to the wall where the kitchen window faced out over the south field, and there, mounted on the stone wall beside the window, was a small carved sign. Walnut wood, the same material as the box he had made her for their first Christmas. The carving was careful and clean. It said BRNNER, and beneath it, smaller, established 1879. She looked at it for a long time. The year was right. 1879 was when they had been married, when the property had officially become theirs together, though it had been hers since 1878. "It says 1879, she said. "That's when it became ours," he said. She looked at him. "You could have put 1878, she said. "That's when it started." "You want me to change it?" She looked back at the sign. She thought about 1878, the stagecoach, the $40, the promise to herself, the stone walls and the mortar and the capstone and the coffee on market day and the November evenings that were very quiet. And then 1879, and the ring with the green stone and the leaning steepled church, and all the years after. "No," she said. "Leave it." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they looked at the sign together in the evening light. Behind them, inside the house, they could hear James and Eleanor arguing about something, and Thomas making his contribution to the argument in the form of repeated enthusiastic sounds, and the fire in the chimney she had built crackling steadily. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he agreed. "Do you remember what I told you?" she asked. "That day in front of Hadley's store. That you had no intention of falling in love," he said without hesitation. "And what you said." He turned his head to look at her. The evening light was golden and warm. the same light that had been on the day she had first looked properly at him, standing in her field by the old stone foundation, uninvited, assessing her chimney wall with honest eyes. He was older now, and she was older, and the lines of 11 years of weather and work were in both their faces, and he was, as he had always been, the most steadying thing she knew. "Neither did I," he said. "Look at us now." She laughed, really laughed, the way she had laughed that night at the wedding celebration in the square, free and full. And he laughed with her, and the sound of it went out over the south field in the autumn evening, over the wheat stubble and the mesa and the big, indifferent, beautiful sky. They went back inside to their children and their fire and their life, and the carved sign stayed on the wall in the last of the light, solid as stone, as certain as everything they had built. Thomas was 4 when he declared, with the authority of someone who has thought very hard about something, that he was going to be a farmer like his mother. James, who was 9 and in a phase of wanting to be every possible thing simultaneously, was currently deciding between ranching like his father, a military career, and the law. Eleanor, at 11, had written an essay that year at school about the agricultural cooperative that Mr. Greaves had submitted to the county newspaper, which had published it, which had made the entire Brenner household very loud with pride for about a week. Minnie had written her a letter, a real letter, formal, to mark the occasion. She had told her that she was proud of her, and that the cooperative had been built precisely so that people would understand it and write about it and make it part of the country's knowledge of itself. Eleanor had read the letter twice and folded it very carefully and put it in the walnut box that now lived on her shelf, because Minnie had given it to her on her 7th birthday, wanting it to hold the things Eleanor was going to collect. The world outside Dust Creek was changing rapidly in ways that made their own, slower changes feel both connected to something larger and also distinct from it. The frontier was closing. As people said, the government surveys were complete, the maps were full, the wilderness was becoming county by county and mile by mile something more organized. Minnie read the newspapers when they came through and thought about what it meant, about the injustices she had witnessed even in Dust Creek. The Apache families who had been moved off the land to the south over the previous decade, land they had lived on for generations, cleared by policies that were presented as order but were experienced as loss. She had written letters about this too, to whoever she thought might listen, because she had come to believe that writing letters was the most practical form of outrage available to her. Milton shared her feelings, though he expressed them differently, less by writing letters and more by treating the few Apache families she knew of in the county with the uncomplicated respect of a man who saw people as people. It was not a political statement he made of it. It was simply how he was. In 1890, the year James turned 9, Thomas 5, and Eleanor 12, the Brenner family attended the Dust Creek Founders' Day celebration, a new tradition the town had started, marking the 25th anniversary of the town's founding. There were speeches and a picnic and the fiddle music again, and the children ran in 3-legged races, and James came second and was philosophical about it. And Eleanor won the spelling contest for the 3rd consecutive year, which she accepted with the gracious calm of someone who had expected this outcome and was merely waiting for everyone else to catch up to it. Minnie and Milton sat together on a blanket in the shade of the one large cottonwood the town square had, and watched their children and the town around them. And Milton had his arm around her, and she had her head against his shoulder. And Mrs. Fitch came and sat with them for a while, and complained cheerfully about her knees, and told a story about what Dust Creek had been like 25 years earlier, when it was 7 buildings and 2 dogs and a conviction. "You've been good for this town, Minnie," Mrs. Fitch said, patting her hand. "The town's been good to me," Minnie said, and meant it entirely. "Both things can be true," Mrs. Fitch said, which was exactly right. That evening, walking home from the celebration with 3 tired children and 2 horses, and the comfortable exhaustion of a day fully lived, Minnie thought about the woman she had been when she arrived, the fierce, careful woman with her $40 and her solemn promise and her conviction that love was a beautiful word for a trap. She had been right about some of it. Love was not safe. It was not a guarantee of anything. It asked everything and did not promise to keep any of it. But what she had not known then, what she had been too careful and too scarred by other people's losses to see, was that the right love did not spring the trap. It enlarged the cage until the cage was a field. It gave you room and worked beside you, and held the capstone while the mortar set, and asked if it could kiss you instead of just doing it, and told you the truth about its own heart so simply and directly that all your carefully constructed defenses had nothing to defend against. She had had no intention of falling in love. He had had no intention either. And here they were, walking home under the Texas stars with their 3 children asleep on their feet and their life enormous and full behind and around and ahead of them. She took his hand. He held it. The stars were extraordinary. The night was warm. "Milton," she said. He said. "I'm glad," she said, "about all of it." He looked at her in the dark. She could see the familiar lines of his face, the warm steadiness of his eyes. "Me too," he said. "Every day." They walked on, and the stars kept their places, and the prairie held its deep nighttime breath, and Dusk Creek sat quiet behind them and their land lay quiet ahead, and the carved sign by the kitchen window would be there in the morning, solid in the stone, as certain as the chimneys they had built, and the fields they had grown and the family they had made, and the life they had built together out of the particular, stubborn, astonishing fact of having loved each other after all.